I would have done disgusting things to own this PC in 2015. Unforgivable things. The latest generation i7, 32GB of DDR4 memory, and not one but two Titan GPUs in SLI. A beast like this would have ripped and torn through games of its era, but the subsequent decade hasn't been kind. We've seen the fall of SLI and the rise of ray tracing and upscaling. 12GB of VRAM might be all well and good, but 4 cores and 8 threads is now considered low spec. Can the 2015 dream last in 2025? "2015 was a significant year for me. It's the year I decided to come back from a long hiatus and get back into PC building again, so a lot of the components I researched for this build did not feel that old. This is the stuff that, for the most part, was beyond my reach at the time it launched, but nowadays it's all pretty cheap. Starting off with the CPU, and I deferred to my audience for this choice, which, on reflection, wasn't my smartest idea. The i7 6700K was the best desktop CPU Intel released in 2015, which by default made it the best gaming CPU in 2015, as the Ryzen revolution wouldn't begin for a couple more years, so it's not really surprising that it won 66% of the vote. That being said, the i7 5775C launched earlier that same year, filling the gap between Haswell and Skylake with an interesting proposition: a 128MB pool of EDRAM that could be used as a level 4 cache. I don't know if its lower instructions per clock and less overclocking headroom would have made it any better than the 6700K, but it would have been interesting to find out. Alas, it only gained 22% of the votes. A better choice, certainly in one aspect, would have been one of the X99 high-end desktop chips. They have more cores and cache than regular desktop chips, but also more PCIe lanes, which would have been relevant for my GPU selection, but we'll come back to that. Anyway, I'd already featured one of those Broadwell E CPUs in my 2014 anniversary build, and X299 wouldn't come out for another year, so I was less interested in revisiting that platform again. Regardless of whether it's the best, most interesting choice or not, I went with the audience and picked up the 6700K for just under £50. The motherboard I chose to pair with it is a monster by any standards, and one that I got for a very good price. The Maximus 8 Hero is a Z170 board with some nice modern conveniences, like NVMe drive support and even a USB-C port, and some enthusiast-friendly features like the hardware power and reset buttons. The formula would have been even nicer, but it cost like 3 times as much, and I got this on sale for a mere £44, meaning this former flagship hardware cost just under £100. The cooler is an era-appropriate NZXT Kraken X62 with their infamous mirrored shroud over the cold plate that some brands are still copying even now. However, you'll have to take my word for it. I lost the mini USB cable, so the LEDs don't work, and I don't get access to the CAM software either. Despite its age and the fact that it's been sat in a cupboard for 3 years, it's still keeping the 6700K in check, even overclocked. For RAM, I chose some stuff that's maybe a little anachronistic, but I had it to hand already. This Team Force Dark kit consists of 4 8GB sticks of DDR4-3600 with a cache latency of 14, and it looks pretty sick too. The storage is a 500GB Samsung drive that I've been using for a few years, but again is not quite authentically 2015, plus I ended up plugging in a second 4TB drive because of the sheer number of games I've tested. The operating system is Windows 10, which of course released in 2015, and isn't much longer for this world. The GPUs were originally going to be a brace of monstrous Geforce Titan X's from Nvidia. Compared to the 980 Ti, these Maxwell 2 based flagships didn't offer much more than bragging rights at the time, at least as far as gamers were concerned, but having 2 of them in SLI was surely a dream combo in 2015. And that's what this video is all about, right? Well, after the first half dozen or so benchmarks only resulted in a couple of games even using the second GPU, and attempts to force alternate frame rendering resulted in performance actually halving rather than doubling, I mostly gave up on the idea. The 2015 Dream Machine subsequently only has a single Titan X, like some common peasant. Everything was assembled in a case that I'm quite proud of and fortunate to have gotten hold of. The NZXT Source 340 was the very same model of PC case I bought in 2016, less than a year after returning to the hobby, and having decided that my new gear needed something a bit more modern and attractive than the Thermaltake box I'd been using up until then. This one was being sold on eBay as new old stock, with even the film still in place on the acrylic window. Some other buyers were probably put off by the fact that it was being missold as the S340 Elite, which had tempered glass and released the following year, but I was just happy to get a truly period-appropriate case for this build, in new condition. Also, the white finish would have been a great match to my Z97 Arctic motherboard for the i7-5775C, but no, the people have spoken. The unimaginative people have. With all that being said, I rounded up a selection of titles from across the last decade of gaming, trying where possible to avoid too much overlap with my Titan X review from 2023, which is obviously still fairly relevant. Starting with the post-apocalypse never seems to go out of fashion, especially if it's Fallout. The fourth game in Bethesda's long-running RPG series isn't many people's favourites. Lots of gamers are nostalgic for 3, 1 and 2 have their fans, and New Vegas is the one I spent the most time in, but 4 is the latest and most vibrant of the single-player games in the series. It's also a prime example of the kind of game you'd have booted up after purchasing your dream gaming PC in 2015, and you'd have been disappointed if you couldn't crank the sliders all the way up at 4K. So, prepare for disappointment. Indoors seemed fine, but out in the open world things get heavy, and the dual GPUs struggle to deliver much above 50 FPS. 1% lows are pretty poor, and I thought that might indicate a problem with SLI. After all, this is one of the main problems caused by multi-GPUs, and that's one of the reasons it fell out of favour over the years. However, when I came back later on to test with just one Titan installed, things weren't all that different. Performance overall was impacted by about 15% or so, but 1% lows were still pretty bad. This isn't a good start, is it? I bought Project Cars in 2015 and utterly messed it up. This was very much on the simulation side of Simcade racing, and I was struggling to turn corners without spinning out, so I abandoned this one very quickly. Coming back to it for the first time in a decade, and I can see why I struggled. The controller is hypersensitive and probably needs the dead zones tweaking a bit, and every attempt I made at a run around Spa in a McLaren ended up with me spinning out. After finding something a bit more on my level, I completed a run at 4K with max quality settings and an average of 76 FPS. Not bad performance for the Dream Machine, but not a lot of room for growth. There was a small benefit to be had from SLI, gaining 7% or so from the extra $1,000 investment, and naturally suffering in percentile lows as a result, because that's what SLI does. In fact, we probably have the micro stutter associated with multi-GPU setups to thank for the way games are benchmarked these days. Arkham Knight was the first title I tested that made me question why I'd bought 2 Titans, and it probably would have done the same in 2015. Of course, most PC gamers in 2015 would have asked why they bought Arkham Knight at all. It was a nightmare of a port at the time, and it's still on the list of worst PC versions, despite all the garbage we've suffered since then. Even with the luxury of a decade of patches though, I still didn't have a decent time. SLI just flat out didn't work at first, and diving into the Nvidia app to choose different SLI rendering modes usually only hurt performance, turning the game into a slideshow. Perhaps if I got more PCIe lanes it would have been a different story, but as it is, SLI just isn't viable here. As it turns out, neither is GameWorks. I'd have thought the flagship Geforce card would have been able to handle this Nvidia fluff feature that makes beautiful smoke effects, but enabling it meant for sub 60 FPS at 1440p and sub 40 FPS at 4K. Without GameWorks, the game is very smooth at 1440p, though I'd probably cap it at 60 even with a 90 plus average. At 4K, it's still short of the 60 FPS mark, falling a little below the PAL refresh rate on average. Rise of the Tomb Raider is, to date, the last entry in the modern Tomb Raider series that most people seem to like, with 2018's Shadow losing a lot of its more ardent fans for, well, modern gaming reasons. Rise is still a beautiful game, perhaps with slightly worse facial animations than newer games, and uses bloom a bit more than I think is necessary. I had some luck with SLI. 4K ran at an acceptable 64 FPS average, while the 1% and 0.1% lows meant for a less than smooth experience. But, in fairness, that wasn't a whole lot better with SLI turned off. Once again, I had to turn the resolution down to 1440 to get a decent single GPU experience, which is kinda sad, in theory. I challenge most people to tell 1440 from 4K in actual gameplay, and it's hard to feel too bad for people who'd have dropped an extra grand on a second GPU just to get slightly nicer cutscenes. I know I said I didn't want to cover too much old ground, but it seems impossible to talk about the games of 2016 without mentioning Doom. You'd expect old heads like me to wax lyrical about 90s shooters, and I do, but in my opinion 2016's Doom and its sequel Doom Eternal are about as good as the genre gets, and anyone starting out in PC gaming in 2025 should look at these games before anything newer. I had no luck enabling SLI on this setup. In fact, even having the second card in the system with single GPU selected in the Nvidia app ruined 0.1% lows and felt like a laggy mess, so I physically ripped the second Titan from its slot and tried again. The average at 4K Ultra is, once more, a bit short of 60 FPS, so dropping resolution would probably have been the smart move. The last time I tested the Titan X in Doom, it saw over 120 FPS at 1440 Ultra, though to be fair, that was paired with a modern Ryzen, so perhaps this i7 could have been a bottleneck. The second coming of Star Wars Battlefront 2 in the summer of 2025 has already come to a close, but it got me interested in the game for the first time ever. This unexpected resurgence came thanks to a bunch of newfound goodwill for the franchise. Andor Series 2 was a landmark in television. The 20th anniversary of Revenge of the Sith was, I assume, being celebrated ironically, and Fortnite's latest crossover event had people pining for a real online Star Wars game. Now, the multiplayer mode has died down a bit, but there are still some people playing, but I chose to test the game out in the single player campaign, which I've never actually played. I know, calls himself a Star Wars nerd. Once again, SLI is off the table, and 4K is too much for one Titan to handle alone. At 1440, I think I might still want to play with the settings a bit because in the Endor level, the 1% and 0.1% scores are pitiful, despite a fairly healthy 74 FPS average. The mainstream press still hasn't fully cottoned on to the importance of gaming in the 21st century media landscape, and still thinks in terms of Pac-Man and Space Invaders, so it's games like Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice that really grab attention, and awards. Melina Juergen's performance as Senua won BAFTAs and other more gaming-centered acclaim, and to be fair, it's a very pretty and engaging game, if a little short-lived and with not a whole lot of depth to the combat, and nobody likes invisible walls. Unfortunately, a game like this is out of reach of the Titan X. SLI isn't an option, and in fact makes performance worse, and a single card can barely produce a playable result at 4K very high. 1440 is at least over 30 FPS, and if we're being charitable we could call that a playable experience, but those of us who find 60 FPS sluggish will be dropping settings, which seems like a crime in a game so notoriously good looking. 2018 was the year that brought us the first ray tracing enabled graphics cards, and so also brought us the first ray traced games. Despite all the processing power on display here, the 2015 Dream Machine is stuck with RTX in the off position, but thankfully it's pitifully underused in Battlefield 5, so I'm not missing much. The multiplayer scene never quite went away in Battlefield 5, but as that side of the game is pretty much a sniper fest, I didn't really want to play it in this video, so once more I'm testing in the campaign. I know you wouldn't play BF5 with ultra settings in any kind of competitive mode, but I thought it would be appropriate for a game that, again, spent a lot of development time and money on looking as good as it does. Unfortunately, again, that means no 4K, and 1440 is barely above 50 FPS. Also, there's an ungodly amount of stutter, despite the fact that I'm running in DX11, which is supposed to be the API you choose when you don't want stutter in this game. Odyssey was actually my first Assassin's Creed game. Criminal, I know. But I have my reasons for steering clear of the franchise before this. One of my old college friends had turned into a conspiracy theorist and a proponent of the ancient aliens theory, and Assassin's Creed's Isu storyline smelled a little too much of that for my tastes, so I'd never really given it a chance. I got Odyssey for free with this Samsung SSD on Black Friday 2018, and in 2019 I hurt my back and was off work for a few weeks, so short of anything else to do with my time off, I gave it a try. Ubisoft's vast open world and repetitive but strangely compelling gameplay loop is very compatible with being housebound and unable to walk away, plus I've always had a soft spot for ancient Greece. The AC games of this era were of course incredibly demanding on hardware, and 4K very high is completely out of the question, barely even touching a cinematic 24 FPS, and with 1% and 0.1% lows in the 20s. 1440p is a bit more in the Titan X's lane, and averages just short of 40 FPS, but does at least stay above 30 99.9% of the time. That last bit was completely off the top of my head, no script. I'd forgotten to write anything. I'm impressed with myself. Well done, Iceberg. Longtime viewers will know I'm a huge fan of the Respawn Jedi games. Fallen Order is still one of my all-time favourites, as much for the story as the gameplay, but it's the only game in recent times I've played end-to-end 4, maybe even 5 times now. Think of all the other games I could have played. Anyway, Fallen Order often comes up in lists of games which support SLI, so I thought I'd give it one last chance to impress. Which... I guess? I could run it at 4K Epic at over 30 FPS, which is more than a single card's capable of, but the 1440p run failed to reach a smooth 60. Stacking SLI micro stutter on top of the standard UE4 loading stutter makes for terrible frame times, which isn't necessarily game breaking, but it's probably not worth the fuss. There was a small revolution in gaming that occurred during the COVID lockdowns of 2020. Cozy, relaxing, chilled out experiences that didn't really offer a challenge, but could take us away from the mundane horror of everyday life. For me, it was the time I really got into Subnautica, but I think it also explains the popularity of Microsoft Flight Sim 2020. Normally this is a hardcore sim genre, used by real-life pilots for training material. Every plane and cockpit is built in meticulous detail, and flight physics are modelled with incredible realism. Despite this, the genius of FS 2020 came in its accessibility. You can fly with a regular gamepad, with the vastly complex flight deck boiled down to console-friendly face buttons, bumpers and triggers. Moreover, you can jump into the sim with your plane already in mid-flight over anywhere in the world and just fly for hours, enjoying the blue skies and the relaxing soaring soundtrack, or just zoned out to the white noise of your engines. It probably pissed off a lot of aviation enthusiasts, but Flight Sim 2020 gained itself a huge casual audience, helped no doubt by its inclusion in Game Pass. Of course, by 2020 the world of PC hardware has moved on, and the Titan X is barely sufficient for even 1440 gaming anymore. With the slider moved across to high end, the average FPS is just 30, which is probably just about acceptable in this genre. Dropping to 1080 scarcely improves matters, as while the average climbs to 40, the lows are still being held back by the CPU. You could probably eke out a few more frames by dropping quality settings, but if you're here for the vibes rather than the simulation aspect, this is an okay experience. Forza Horizon 5 is a fantasy game where people get to own cars and houses and get paid for doing what they love all at the same time. It's also a virtual tourism experience for Mexico, minus the orange filter and guitar strings. And it has radio stations that have single-handedly pushed my knowledge of current music forwards by at least half a decade. Yes, I know it's out of date again now. Yes, my favourite song is a 3-decade-old track by The Offspring. Just get off my back, alright? Let me be old. Also, Forza Horizon 5 is a racing game, and one that runs on a wide range of hardware. But it does have a notable preference for newer models. At 4K high, the game is running at a largely acceptable console-like 30+, whereas 1440 would need a few settings reduced to hit a smoother 60 FPS. I found it pretty playable, especially as most of the game isn't quite as demanding as the benchmark would suggest, plus the 12GB of VRAM meant there was no danger of running out of memory. From Software's first venture into open worlds in 2022 was a colossal success critically and financially, but unfortunately the developers have never really got the hang of PC ports. Elden Ring at least had a fixed 60 FPS cap rather than the 30 FPS of many of their earlier games, but breaking that limit meant resorting to mods that were incompatible with online play, meaning a big chunk of the game's experience was lost. From my perspective as a benchmarkist, this can be a bit wasteful, especially if your hardware is far above the recommended spec. In this case, however, we're a long way off. 4K is going to need some reduced quality settings, and 1440 at maximum is falling short of 50 FPS. 1080 can reach the 60 FPS cap, sometimes, but there are enough frame time spikes to bring the average and percentile lows down further than you'd like. Not unplayable by any stretch, but perhaps a bit tougher to pull off crucial parries than it would otherwise be. People had very different experiences of gaming in 2023. To many people, it was one of the greatest years ever, home to some of the finest new releases the medium had ever seen, and that was never more clear than in Baldur's Gate 3. The early 2020s were seeing a resurgence in tabletop RPGs in general, and D&D in particular, so the third entry in the Baldur's Gate series was ideally placed to capitalise on this trend. Larian Studios leaned into the dice-rolling mechanisms that earlier games had hidden, and with thousands of lines of recorded dialogue, the devs had attempted to anticipate their players' every possible whim, however unlikely or sordid. It was the most D&D game a D&D player could ask for, short of being on literal pen and paper. Although not known for being particularly heavy on system requirements, some parts of the game can be quite heavy on the CPU, so a constant high frame rate isn't on the cards here. At 1440 I cranked settings up to ultra and saw a decent 38 FPS average in Baldur's Gate itself, though with plenty of little stutters and a few moments where stuff failed to properly load in. The dark side of gaming in 2023 was most felt by PC gamers, and somewhat confusingly for some people, meant that this year is seen as a turning point, when gaming started a downward spiral. The term bad optimization was being bandied around by internet commentators, used to describe games whose performance was unexpectedly bad, and which didn't really give anything in return for this increased demand on hardware. There are a lot of games I could mention here, but the one that started what I call the VRAM panic was the long-awaited PC port of The Last of Us. The game launched in a pretty terrible state, and even once it had been patched, it was still far more demanding than the closed world and linear gameplay would suggest. The key to this was VRAM, a resource that was in limited supply at the time thanks to a GPU shortage and to Nvidia's characteristic stinginess when it comes to memory, but which the PS5 had in abundance. The Titan X doesn't have a major issue here, though 12GB can still be borderline at some settings, but the overall heaviness of this game means the Maxwell flagship GPU can only achieve a semi-playable 34 FPS at 1080p high, and dropping to medium only offers a couple more frames than this. Despite all this VRAM, the Titan X just can't do this one justice. The fact that 2024's Black Myth Wukong was a hit in the West is not all that surprising. It was hyped for its graphics for years beforehand, and gamers were crying out for the next Elden Ring. Unfortunately for us, BMW was made using Unreal Engine 5, an engine that had shown phenomenal promise in early tech demos, but whose actual implementation was often far from perfect. The engine continued UE4's legacy of stuttering, from traversal stutter as you move from one area to another, to shader compilation stutter as new visual effects are loaded into memory. Some of these problems can be brute forced with powerful enough hardware. Alas, that doesn't really include anything from the Maxwell generation. Medium is as low as I'm willing to go in this one because low introduces flickering shadows, and at native 1080 that's barely good enough for 30 FPS, and lows dip into the 20s. Upscaling looks pretty bad in this one too, but it might be the only option available to the old Titan. The year isn't over, but 2025 already has a few contenders for Game of the Year. Some, like Silksong, aren't really the kind of game you'd expect to test a Titan, even a decade-old one. Others are more demanding, like, for example, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, a CryEngine-based title that doesn't have the most cutting-edge graphics in the world, but which delivers the modern-day fantasy of a life of medieval simplicity among verdant green fields. It's some credit to KCD2 that the Titan can not only run this game, it can almost run it at native 4K with the high preset, averaging a cinematic 24. There's plenty of drops below that, so I can't recommend you actually try this, but it's fun to see nonetheless. 1440 high is much more palatable, with some drops below 30 that make me think medium might be a safer bet, but still, for a 2025 game, this is a good result. Finally, a game that defies a lot of recent PC gaming trends. A JRPG made in France, based on an original and rather unique IP, made by a small studio but with a voice cast that make me legitimately say, holy shit. Clair Obscur Expedition 33 is an Unreal Engine 5 title that heavily uses Lumen, at least the software version of it, so PC gamers in 2025 were always going to resent it somewhat. However, known engine issues aside, this is one of the better examples of the games we've come to dread. Naturally, by this point, our 2015 rig is long past 2160p or even 1440p without upscaling, and I found that even 1080p is rough at the high preset. Switching to 1080 low saw my character briefly lose his head, which is how you know the game's French, but it also saw the average climb above the 30 FPS mark, and even lows are acceptable, if not ideal. You can start playing with upscaling, but to me the game starts to look a bit dicey once the render resolution drops too far. A decade on, and this beast ain't blitzing through the latest AAA releases anymore. Maxwell series GPUs like the Titan X are losing driver support in 2025, meaning future game updates and upcoming new releases may have performance issues or bugs that nobody will be obliged to fix. SLI is now clearly worse than useless, and you could get better performance than a single Titan X from a $250 ARC B580. The i7 6700K can be surpassed by a 3-generation-old i3, and yet, despite its age, the 2015 Dream PC isn't dead yet. It can still play modern games, if only at a fraction of the frame rate of those in its heyday, and with resolutions and settings dropped precipitously. Overkill as it might be, it could still play Silksong, or Hades 2, or Counter-Strike 2 without issue. There are plenty of games that are out of reach of this PC, And as time goes on, that list is only going to grow longer. But so is the list of esports and indies that will run quite happily on a system like this. For my part, I'm going to be stripping this system back down again. I'll use the case for my 2016 anniversary build next year, and I'll be keeping the Z170 and one of the Titan X's in storage just in case I need them for more videos in the future. In the meantime, last year's 2014 anniversary build video is linked on screen. Now, thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.